you for joining this session on international trends in donor selection for hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. Over the next few minutes, we'll explore how the landscape of donor selection has evolved dramatically, particularly in the last decade, and we'll examine some of the outcomes data, international guidelines, and provide an evidence-based framework for optimal donor selection, review some of the things that we'll be covering. So we'll start with some a historical evolution. I'll try to, I won't say sprint through it, because I do think that there is some interesting takeaways from where we've come from that could potentially direct where we're today and where we're heading. We will also look at the various stem cell sources that are currently available to us, because this field is also growing exponentially. Then, of course, we need to compare some of the clinical outcomes between those various sources so that once we get to that selection point, we know what it is we're dealing with. But we can't do that without also taking into account that many organizations around the world have also spent quite a bit of time thinking about this and have developed guidance and guidelines and recommendations, specifically EBMT, ASTCT, NMVP, WMDA, and others. And then once we've sort of collated all of that information, we can apply that and come up with a hopefully simple decision framework to apply to every patient case. And then finally, I'd like to give a little bit of a glimpse of what is currently in development and what you can expect to see potentially come to market in the next few months, years. So, as I mentioned, there's a lot of development and evolution, especially in the more recent years, but the history of stem cell transplantation really spans over about 7 decades. We'll focus on 4 key areas, but before we do that, I'd like to just do one quick slide on the father of stem cell transplantation, Dr. Donald Thomas. In 1957, he performs the first human bone marrow transplant using intravenous infusion. Although initially unsuccessful due to rejection, it established the foundational technique. A few years later, well, a decade later, he was successful, or he found success in immunodeficiency, specifically in allogeneic marrow grafts, reportedly for patients with primary immune deficiency disorder, proving engraftment and immune reconstitution were possible. Almost another decade later, he started dabbling in leukemias and unrelated donors, where he performed a large series of transplants and that was published and could show a cure. And then finally, in the year 1990, he was actually awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine for his discoveries concerning organ and stem cell transplantation in the treatment of human disease. So he is truly considered the father of stem cell transplantation. But those 4 eras that I mentioned, it really kicks off then, of course, in the 1990s, where in 1991, the first unrelated stem cell registry was established. And this really started standardizing what search algorithms would have to deal with in future. A few years later, the first cord blood bank was established, where they also started banking umbilical cord blood from newly born babies. A few years after that, the DNA-based typing evolved from just serology to now also being DNA-based. And that definitely showed that some of the transplants that up until that point were considered matched were in fact mismatched. And it did explain a little bit better why some patients saw better outcomes than others. So it sort of opened up that curtain a little bit and for more discovery in that field. In 2004, the WMDA published the first version of the WMDA standards. And of course, with standardization also comes improvement of systems and products. And we are already in I don't know how many versions on, but we keep improving through standardization, the global exchange. And then, of course, outcomes parity. Major studies started showing that an 8 out of 8 match of matched unrelated donor outcomes were approaching that of matched sibling donors in early disease. And also this was around the time that cord blood unit transplantation peaked. We then move into the 2010s, a slightly different era, again shown with even more advances, specifically in the 10 out of 10 matching. So it was in this around this time that 10 out of 10 matching was really popularized, and which proved even better outcomes for patients, especially if you're matching for A, B, C, D, R, and DQ. But then also shortly after, early haploidentical transplantation platforms emerged, including T-cell depletion and the use of post-transplantation cyclophosphamide. Next generation sequencing in HLA typing also enabled true high-resolution HLA typing at allele level, revealing additional mismatches missed through earlier methods. And of course, more refining in terms of understanding matching through by adding HLA-DPB1 that really allowed for, even when you know that there's going to be a mismatch, to see how you can mitigate graft versus host disease. And through all of the haplo and mismatch transplantation, it absolutely also improved the alternative donor parity, which meant that even more patients now had the option of a stem cell transplant. Still in the 2010s, in 2016, there was a massive boom in the use of PT-Cy. So post-transplant cyclophosphamide becomes the standard for all haploidentical donors, which again expanded access to transplant. 2017, 2018 saw improved outcomes, and through the same protocol, the rise in mismatched unrelated donor transplants. Donor equivalence, of course, there was a growing consensus on equivalence of MUD donors and haplotransplants for many indications, but this also meant that cord blood unit transplantation started to wane. We will go over why fewer and fewer centers were using cord blood in a few moments. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And in this era, well, between 2020 and where we are now, a lot of the development that took place in recent years were really fueled by a lot of the discoveries and the need, a lot of the requirements that had to suddenly be met because of the pandemic. So COVID-19 disrupted international donor travel and collection logistics, leading to rapid expansion in cryopreserved unrelated donor products. Global registries pivoted to cryopreservation as a standard practice. But through innovation comes also a lot of cool solutions, like the NMDP's Donor for All initiative, which formalized the acceptance of multiple mismatch donors down to a 5 out of 8 match, where if that means if you're matching for 10 out of 10s, that is effectively a haplo unrelated donor. But of course, it has to be prefaced that this has to happen with the use of PT-Cy. Because of some of these innovations, all of the haplos, all of the cryopreservation, a lot of the guidances were then also updated just last year. And around that same time, 2024, 2025, DKMS pioneered the approach of adult donor cryopreserved units. So this is taking PBC from adult donors and cryopreserving them for as a sort of off-the-shelf product that can be purchased or requested. And that brings us to where we are today. If we move on then, as I mentioned in the second part of this talk, we'll cover a couple of the different sources that are currently available to us. And If you think about it, there could be even as many as 7 different sources. And I know that that sounds like a really high number, and you're not sure how I get to that number. Let's go through them. Many of these are well known to you, and I won't spend too much time. But it is important that we just remind ourselves about the pros and cons of each of these sources, so that when we get to the decision framework, we can sort of apply that to our knowledge base. So we start with the gold standard. It has always been and will forever, I guess, be the matched sibling donor. The key advantages of having a matched sibling donor or using a matched sibling donor is that it is still the gold standard for outcomes. They're often rapidly available. It is the most cost effective, and you always have access to the cells. Well, always is a strong word, but you will have access to the cells should you need a top up. Unfortunately, even with the gold standard donor, there are some limitations. So in terms of limited availability, I know I just said that you have access to the cells, but of course, not all patients have a sibling or a matched sibling. Based on Mendelian inheritance, only roughly 25 to 30% of patients might have a matched sibling, but with family sizes growing smaller and smaller, especially in Western cultures, this percentage is also dwindling. And what is familiar to many of you would be the fact that donor age is often a limitation. Patients aren't necessarily young. These are also older patients, and their siblings tend to then also be around that same age range, which means that they have you don't necessarily benefit from the age, and they might also have some comorbidities that make them an unsuitable donor and would put their own health at risk. So in conclusion, while this is the gold standard for outcomes, it is not a given that you would be able to have access to a matched sibling donor. Then I guess would have to go to the next best thing, which is a matched unrelated donor. This, of course, is a volunteer donor identified through international registries who is typed at high resolution for HLA-A, B, C, DR, and most of the time DQ and even DPB1. The advantages of using a matched unrelated donor is that there's obviously a massive global donor pool. We are currently sitting at just a smidge over 44 million registered volunteer donors, but this includes adult donors and cord blood units. There's also proven long-term outcomes. So it's been the standard of care for many decades, and survival rates are pretty good. You also have access to younger donors. Registries are now recruiting donors as young as 16. Some of them only really becoming available at 18, but there are in some cases 16-year-old donors available for selection. And of course, you have backup options. Some registries are so big and they have duplicated the same genotypes so many times that even if you can't get hold of the first, second, or third donor or option on your list, there might even be a fourth or a fifth. So backup donor options are often available, especially for patients with Western European ancestry. But like with anything, there are also limitations and challenges for my donors. The first, and probably the most concerning, the one that sort of defined my career up until now, is the time to transplantation. It can take really long to perform the search, find the donor, do the confirmatory typing, and complete the workup. And especially in very urgent transplant cases, your patient might just not have the time to wait for something like this. There's also a significant access disparity. The vast majority of the unrelated global donor pool caters for the people with Western European ancestry. There are not that many donors representing minorities in the world, and that is really unfortunate. But of course, all registries are currently actively working on having donor recruitment and retention programs that really focus on their regional minorities. So not necessarily global minorities, but regional minorities. And of course, there is the higher GVHD risk that I'm sure you all have experienced mitigating. So if we want to just encapsulate a little bit about that disparity, an NMDP Be the Match study a few years ago showed that white Europeans in the US have about close to 80% chance of finding a fully matched 8 out of 8 donor, whereas at the time an African American patient only had less than 30% chance of finding a matched unrelated donor. But I've already mentioned the Donor for All study that they performed, and we will see how they have managed to improve these odds. So you can't talk about a matched unrelated donor without also talking about a mismatched unrelated donor, and this is becoming very popular. The definition is the same as an unrelated donor that we just covered. However, this donor has multiple mismatches, so it's not necessarily just a 9 out of 10 or a 7 out of 8. It can potentially go as low as a 5 out of 10 or a 5 out of 8 donor. And this should always be transplanted, or a product from this sort of donor should always be transplanted with the use of PT-Cy. The key advantages is it expands access. If you think your patient can tolerate mismatches, then the potential list of donors grows exponentially. And the more mismatches the patient can tolerate and your center is good at managing, the more options you have. And so then really you can start picking off almost like donors off like a menu where you can choose for the most optimal age, the most optimal CMV, the most optimal time frame. So definitely improved access for all. It's potentially also a bridge to transplant. This is a claim that was made in the research I did while preparing for this presentation. I'm not a physician, and I won't necessarily say that this is the best option, especially in the South African context, where a stem cell transplant of any kind is very expensive and hard to come by, and bed space is always limited. So I don't know if this is a recommendation or sort of a pro everywhere equally in the world, but what it alludes to here is that you can always do a mismatched transplant while you're waiting for the fully matched donor. How realistic that is, I'm not so sure. But of course, there is also the improved safety with the use of PT-Cy. So at the time that I was a search coordinator, transplant physicians wouldn't even consider a 7 out of 8. Very rarely, a 7 out of 10, very rarely an 8 out of 10, and from time to time a 9 out of 10. But now with the PT-Cy, I think this is sort of becoming a little bit more acceptable. And then, as I mentioned, if you have a much longer list of potential donors, you could always have access to a much younger donor. The limitations and challenges here is that there is definitely a higher risk profile for GVHD. The selection becomes really, really complex because it's easy to pick a match. And that's maybe a strange thing to say, but as a former search coordinator, if you run a search and there's a 10 out of 10, that's obviously the one you're going to pick. But if you run a search and there are no 10 out of 10 donors and you need to start weighing up various mismatched donors, that's really, really tricky because which mismatch is the best mismatch? You're sort of between a rock and a hard place. And then there's the delayed immune reconstitution to take into account. This does, however, mean that close to 100% of patients could potentially have a donor. The next source, I will really sprint through this one because I think most of you have worked with haploidentical related donors. So this is a related donor, typically a parent, a child, or a sibling who shares exactly one HLA haplotype with the recipient. Advantages: near universal availability, rapid access with highly motivated family. Donor choice, you can definitely choose whether you want an older parent, younger sibling, whatever. And then, of course, improved outcomes with PT-Cy. The limitations: high alloreactivity risk, delayed immune reconstitution, and the sad but very real cytokine storm. But again, it does mean that there is high availability for haplo-related donors. The next source is the cord blood units. Right now, there is just shy of 800,000 cord blood units stored in the global donor database, or in our case, the donor cord database, global cord database. So a cord blood unit is hematopoietic stem cells derived from umbilical cord blood. The advantages, again, rapidly available because this is the original off-the-shelf product, if you like. There's also a lower GVHD risk because of the immature cells, the naive stem cells. Ethnic diversity, sure, but because cord bloods are so expensive for South African patients, because South Africa, as from at least last I heard, didn't have a public cord blood bank, means that all cord blood units have to be imported, and they are even internationally considered a much more expensive product. So I'm not sure that it is really, at least in the South African context, it's improving ethnic diversity access. But there's, of course, also the viral safety benefit. Challenges: delayed engraftment. This is very well known and very well described. The limited cell dose. Some of the units are only 25 milliliters, so it's a really small cassette, and it's a one and done. I've already mentioned the cost, and you have no access to the donor should you need a top up, or if you need a DLI, any kind of thing. After that, it's done and done. And of course, with cord blood units, because they're so small, the volume isn't necessarily the critical point. It's really the counts. So 2.5 is a TNC of 2.5 is sort of considered a therapeutic dose. So you definitely want more than that. In terms of CD34, you definitely want more than 1.5. And this is both pre-freeze values. If you look in the WMDA reports, you often have the pre-freeze value and the post-thaw value, and you should really be looking at the post-thaw value because there's always a viability issue when it comes to thawing cord blood units, or any cryopreserved unit for that matter. But all of this being said, even though I said earlier that cord blood transplantation is on the decline, it's sort of tapering out right now, but there's over 40,000 cord blood unit transplants that have already taken place, and with high degrees of success. Then, of course, is the adult donor cryopreserved unit, and this is probably the newest kid on the block. Some of you might have already encountered some of these products, but to others, I guess it would be very, very new. So I will take a little bit more time explaining what these are. Adult donor cryopreserved units are high quality, pre-collected, and cryopreserved unrelated donor products banked for what is called or considered undirected use. These units are typically surplus cells from routine collections or specifically recruited high-frequency haplotypes stored, ready to be shipped. The benefits are that they are immediately available. This is an off-the-shelf product. By the time you see it on a search list, this product is already ready. It's fully tested. It won't be on the shelf if it wasn't ready to ship, and it has all of the information you need. It's unlike cord blood units where sometimes they're not fully typed, or they don't have any post-thaw values, or they still need to do some CFU panels before they can ship. None of that's true for ADCUs. For ADCUs, you have all of that information up front, and they are immediately available. It does mean that there's scheduling certainty. You don't have to start conditioning the patient until you have the product in hand, and that can be as early as next week. And then there's also standardized quality. Because since cryopreservation has been so popularized since the pandemic in 2020, a lot of cryopreservation standards have since arose through many accreditation frameworks, FACT, FE, all of those, and you know that whatever they've cryopreserved was done in a really high quality way, and you can really trust that process. But there's some strategic considerations, and this is not necessarily for you as a transplant physician or a transplant coordinator, but it is things to keep in mind. Because it's such a new product, there are still some ethics and regulatory things to keep in mind that you might still need to navigate. Also, it requires very specific donor consent, as you can imagine. The banks they don't want to make the same mistakes that have been made in cord blood banking, so they are curating the banks for really high utility, so the most common haplotypes or the really rare haplotypes, but in limited numbers. And then cryopreservation impact refers to the fact that it really relies entirely on frozen products. So there is still the post-thaw dynamic that you have to keep in mind. But the main benefit of this product is definitely the fact that it is off the shelf. And you can see that the time to transplant for a banked ADCU is superior to almost any other product that I've mentioned before. If we want to do a quick graft source biology comparison, this is not new information, this is really just a quick summary. But if we want to look at just some of the highlights here, the graft kinetics and how they stack up against one another, a PBC, you find rapid neutrophil and platelet recovery. Bone marrow is sort of in the intermediate space, and then cord blood, definitely delayed neutrophil and platelet recovery. In terms of immune reconstitution for PBC, you see faster early immune recovery. Bone marrow, again, is sort of intermediate, and for cord blood, it's a slow recovery. In terms of GVHD profile, PBC definitely has the much higher risk profile for chronic GVHD compared to bone marrow and cord. Bone marrow is on the lower end, and cord is even lower than that. And to decide when to use which of these, the key usage for a PBC is definitely adults and for rapid engraftment needs. Bone marrow you would normally use for pediatrics or non-malignant diseases, and cord blood definitely when there's an urgent need, but I think that will soon be replaced by ADCUs. And for minority ancestry, yes, maybe not in South Africa, and other such cases. So this is just a quick summary slide, because all of the sources that I mentioned before this slide, there will still be that option between PBC or bone marrow or cord. So keep that in mind. For the ADCUs, from the products that are currently banked called ADCUs, as far as I know, all of them are PBC. This is a very busy slide, and I'm not going to go through it. This is sort of a print and keep in your drawer situation. There's another one like this coming up. So this is really a summary considering availability, time to transplant, GVHD risk, engraftment, and immune reconstitution for each of the products that we just covered. So a little bit of a cheat sheet. I will make sure that Justin has the slides and that he can distribute them. So this is one to keep. We then move on to looking at some outcomes, because we now know what sort of grafts are available. Now you want to see, okay, well, which ones would actually give me the best outcome? And so we're quickly going to look over those. In terms of popularity, at least, if this was a popularity contest, matched unrelated donors are still far more used in sort of the unrelated space. But haploidentical has been catching up rapidly. So has mismatched unrelated donors, at least in the recent years. And we definitely see or expect this trend for multiple mismatched donors to keep rising quite rapidly. Of course, cord blood has declined all around the world. It is very expensive to maintain a cord blood bank. Cord blood units are really expensive to ship
probably be back on Monday.
Sorry, do we have a question?
Yeah. I don't know, because they still working on it. No, we'll do everything. Yeah. Thanks. We can go home now.
Okay, I think I'll carry on then.
That way.
So in terms of 3-year overall survival, this is unadjusted though, so keep in mind this is with heavy patient selection criteria. And here you can see that survival curves are converging across sources, particularly in recent years. This reflects the improved platforms with the PT-Psy, a lot of GVHD prophylaxis, and then other supportive care. So 3-year overall survival is you're seeing quite similar sort of survival rates across the matched sibling, mismatched, unrelated, and haploidentical space.
And then go down.
Sorry, Alicia, let me just ask Bernard Goodwin, can you please just mute yourself? Sorry.
No problem.
Stop doing that.
Okay, I'll carry on. Thanks.
Sorry. Let me just
No worries.
I think the host must just mute him. I can't do it from my side. Let me just see you can. Oh, okay. So Martinez, thank you, Martinez. Thank you. Okay, let's continue. Sorry.
Sure, no worries. We just looked at the 3-year outcomes, but here we have the 1-year post-transplantation outcomes by match level, and this is with PT-Psy. So these are this is comparing matched unrelated donors, an 8 out of 8 with PT-Psy, a multiple mismatch unrelated donor, which is about a 7 out of 8 with PT-Psy, and then a really low match. And comparing them in terms of the overall survival, the graft and rejection survival rates, and also graft versus host, acute graft versus host disease. What is the likelihood of having any of those outcomes for those 3 products? There's also the probability of finding a donor by ethnicity. So what does that mean? If you know that the outcomes are quite favorable, irrespective of which source you're going to need, it is important to then consider, do you really need to be that selective in your patient selection when you are very likely to also find a good enough donor for patients of minority patients that were usually not able to find donors. So maybe it is time to start taking that risk of the 1 or 2 mismatches to transplant a patient that is underrepresented on the global database. So the use of PT-Psy neutralizes the adverse effects of HLA mismatch, resulting in comparable overall survival between 8 of 8 months and multiple mismatch, dramatically increasing donor access for minority populations to over 90%. But of course, not every patient is the same, and it is important to consider the patient population. If you consider just donor selection differences between pediatrics and adults, the donor selection strategies diverge significantly by age. Pediatric recipients tolerate mismatching better, especially cord blood, and you can prioritize long-term graft stability over the graft versus leukemia effect compared to adults. So other things to take into account for when selecting donors for pediatrics is the fact that there are cord blood options for them. If you're using haploidentical, with the increasing use of PT-Psy through specific protocols, haploidentical is still quite popular in Europe, and especially in non-malignant disorders, bone marrow is preferred over PBSC. In terms of minority access and outcomes, this is another patient population that we've touched on now quite a few times during this talk, but there are still massive gaps in national registries as well as the international space. So definitely here you would utilize the alternative donor source or graft source. The haplo multiple mismatch impact has sort of stabilized quite a bit with the use of PT-SI, and with the data from the NMDP, where they've done this, the donor for all study, they have shown, at least in the trials that they have performed, that there are comparable outcomes for matches between 5 and 7 out of 8. That compares to that of the outcomes of matched unrelated donors. So diverse ancestry, if it's a patient with diverse ancestry, definitely consider more on the haplo mismatch side. And then lastly, for a non-malignant strategy for hemoglobinopathies and immune deficiencies, the priority is typically rejection prevention and minimizing GVHD. So matched sibling donors are still the gold standard, but if that's unavailable, high resolution MUDs or haplos with PT-SI are preferred over PBSC. So in terms of time to transplant, of course, this is, again, what sort of defined my career up until now, finding a way to get a donor to the right patient in the right time frame. In terms of what you can get the fastest, it's cord, banked, matched, unrelated, banked, mismatched, unrelated. Haplos are also pretty quick, but of course the registry donor is still the one that is taking the longest. And the graft in pink, I don't think I have to explain. When you have a really, really urgent patient case, you just can't wait. And the longer you wait, the more likely it is that the outcomes would be poor. So in high-risk disease, a delay of anything more than 4 to 6 weeks could significantly increase the relapse and mortality risk. Rapidly available donors are preferred over better matched unrelated donors if the unrelated search is prolonged. So something to think about. Again, here's your second cheat sheet. We don't have to go over this, but it compares the overall survival with GVHD risk, relapse risk, and non-relapse mortality risk across the different sources that I just mentioned. Ideally, this works like a heat map. You'd like to see and avoid as many of the orange and red squares as you can when making a selection. But that brings us then to reviewing some of the true and trusted, well-known guidances available globally. It would be great if everyone in the world can agree on what is the guidance, but that's just not how the world works. So I will cover 4. EBMT, that sort of gets all of their data from European centers, ASTCT, NMDP, CIBMTR, which is more in North America, Canada, and that part of the world, more to the west, and WMDA, which standardizes, at least operationally, and product quality standards, but that is definitely a global standard or globally enforced standards. And then finally, some Japanese recommendations, because Japan's been really good at coming up with recommendations for Asian patient populations and transplantation. So if we kick it off with EBMT, they sort it out by disease. So there's some recommendations for AML, ALL, and other hemoglobinopathies. But there is a major shift in recent years, specifically in the 2025 guidance. They now formally recognize haplo-PT with PT-SI as a standard of care alternative to matched unrelated donors for most acute leukemia indications, removing the experimental or alternative label that was previously applied. They've also added that for cord blood, the recommendation has been downgraded for adults in favor of haplo and mud options. So that's definitely a shift in the thinking from the European countries. For ASTCT NMDP, so the North America, Canada, they have this little algorithm. So first matched sibling donor is always your first choice. If that's not available, a matched unrelated donor, high resolution typed 8 out of 8, but you should prioritize a donor under the age of 35. But if that donor cannot be, that product cannot be obtained or procured within 2 to 3 weeks, you need to do an alternative donor evaluation. Those alternative donors include the haplo donor, the multiple mismatch donor, and even cord blood. This really ties in well with their Donor for All initiative, and some key practice challenges is changes that they made to their routine practice is that they now do routine screening for donor-specific antibodies required for all mismatched donors, and they apply desensitization protocols. They have also done guidelines to emphasize initiating alternative donor workup simultaneously with the MUD search. And I think many registries have noticed this because NMDP often reserves multiple donors at the same time for a single patient. And then in terms of prophylaxis, of course, the PTSI recommendation as a standard GVHD prophylaxis for both haplo and multiple mismatch unrelated donor settings. And of course, the WMDA. There is no donor selection criteria or recommendation or guidance from the WMDA. However, we do take donor care very seriously. We have standardized the criteria for donor recruitment, HLA typing, and data privacy across 55 countries. There's a lot of quality assurance in the sense of benchmarking performance for search times, confirmatory typing, and workup. Of course, we also take a lot of time thinking about traceability and biovigilance. All donors in the world now have a grid number, and that is a globally unique number that all donors have to go by. We do not list them on WMDA if they do not have a grid number. This is new. If you run a search today, you might still find here and there some donors without grids, but we're in the process of updating our software, and when it goes live in about 6 weeks from now, any donor that does not have a grid number will no longer be available in search and match. Of course, we also have SPEAR reporting. This is the biovigilance part. And it is now mandatory to report all serious product and events and adverse reactions to the WMDA. Of course, there's also the donor medical suitability, eligibility criteria for donors to make sure that they are protected, and there is long-term follow-up of all donors that have donated stem cells for up to 10 years. The clinical implication is that selecting donors from a WMDA qualified or certified registry ensures that products meet GMP-like quality standards, reducing the risks for graft failure, transmission of infection, and logistical delays. There's also search efficiency. Accredited registries integrate with the search and match service, providing high-resolution data that minimizes the need for extended CT testing, so hopefully reducing the time to transplantation even further. We have over 44 million records in the database, and it keeps growing thanks to our many members globally. And we have, as of today, because I updated this slide just before we started, 128 listing sources or listing organizations in the world. Japanese guidance, and this is going to be a little bit of a surprise because it's quite a bit different. They still value cord blood almost above all else. So it is their primary alternative source. So unlike Western trends, single unit cord transplantation remains a preferred alternative donor source when a matched sibling donor is unavailable. The Japanese registry data consistently shows superior cord blood transplantation outcomes compared to Western cohorts, but this is quite possibly because of the homogeneity within that patient and donor population, as well as the lower BMIs. So they can actually get away with transplanting much, much smaller products. And of course, the rapid access. They also have graft source preferences. So there is a strong historical and continued preference for bone marrow harvest over PBC from unrelated donors to minimize the chronic GVHD risk. And in terms of donor safety, their guidelines emphasize donor safety and long-term follow-up. PBC mobilization in unrelated donors are adopted more cautiously than in the rest of the world. We also very recently learned through our work with them from the WMDA side that in some cases they hospitalize a matched unrelated donor for up to 2 weeks following a collection. And if you know a little bit about Japanese work culture, being away from the office for 2 weeks for someone that's not actually sick is quite frowned upon, and it's not fun for anyone. And that is likely why they also prefer cord blood, because they don't want to hospitalize healthy people for that long. There is a slight growing trend of haplo with PTCy adoption in Japan, but it's slow, but it's happening. And they're also doing more studies to compare haplotransplantation with cord blood to also improve access within their country. But they are quite self-sufficient. They do not import as many products as I think anyone else. They are able to find unrelated donors or unrelated sources, at least, for almost all of their patients nationally. And so the genetic homogeneity factor is what we just discussed. And here you can really see how it stacks up to trends in the rest of the world. Japan by far uses the most cord blood compared to the rest of the world, US and Europe. In terms of haplo, less than half of what is utilized in the rest of the world. They massively prefer marrow over PBC, unlike what is seen in the rest of the world. Okay, so I guess this is the moment that everyone's been waiting for, and this is this decision-making framework. So let's see what that looks like. So assuming you have a patient that needs an urgent transplant sometime in the next 6 to 8 weeks, the first question you'll ask yourself is, does this patient have an HLA identical sibling that is both available and healthy? If the answer is yes, then of course you proceed to your matched sibling donor because that is the standard of care. However, if the answer to that question is no, then you need to perform a search, and you will be looking for a 10 out of 10 matched unrelated donor that is young, ideally younger than 35, but let's be honest, you need a donor as young as possible. But this donor should also be rapidly available, and that's sort of the trick question here. But if the answer is yes, you can find a 10 out of 10 matched unrelated donor that is available immediately and that's young compared to your patient, then absolutely go ahead and use this matched unrelated donor and take the youngest one you can find. However, if that answer is no, or that donor does exist, but they're only available in a month or 2 months because they're writing exams or they have a wedding or a big vacation coming up, then you do have to go and look at all of these alternative sources that I just mentioned. And it's really important that you also then take into account which of these sources your center has any experience with, whether that's haplo, mismatched transplantation, or cord blood. And I'm happy to report that you don't have to just think about those three, because very soon, in the next 6 to 8 weeks, depending on certain factors, the WMDA will start also listing the banked ADCU products. So these are the peripheral blood stem cells from adult donors that have been cryopreserved and that all of the testing and typing is complete for it. So a true off-the-shelf product. But it is so new that it is not included in any international recommendations yet. So you wouldn't find anything about ADCUs if you ask if you read the EBMT or the CIBMTR recommendations, because it is that new. Okay. If we look a little bit towards the future, what are we seeing now, and what do we think we are going to be seeing in the next few years, weeks, months, years? In North America, we do expect to see haplo and multiple mismatch search to keep rising, and that much unrelated donors will sort of pan out. It will not go away; it will still be there, but it would sort of plateau out. For Europe, haplo also on the rise. Cord transplantation taking a sharp nosedive. Based on a feasibility study, we do not see any levels or very, very low levels of interest in Europe for multiple mismatched unrelated donors. But that is because the vast majority of the donors on the global database are of Western European descent. So in Europe, they don't have a big issue finding a good match, a suitably matched donor for their patients. And then in Asian Pacific areas, there are diverse practices, but we are definitely seeing haplo rising, specifically in China, and cord, we expect to see the same amount of cord transplantations taking place because of access. They have the access, they have the experience, and it means that they can stay nationally, sustain themselves nationally. But what else is coming up? What is out there what can you look out for out in the wild? They are the engineered products, also not completely new, but it's not that readily available. But we will be seeing more of this, and the costs coming down, and more organizations or companies, can't call them organizations, companies making these sorts of products available. The off-the-shelf CRISPRs and the CAR-Ts. And in this sense, we will see a shift from match-based to a product-based selection for high-risk malignancies. Then there's also the scalable platforms, the iPSC banks made from induced pluripotent stem cells, and where they sort of make the HLA null, so they strip off the antigens and sort of have these stealth lines that are engineered. And in that sense, you can expect sort of a shift from donor identification to more a pharmaceutical manufacturing model. So it becomes a pharmaceutical treatment, not necessarily a donor treatment. It sort of really gets under our skin at the WMDA when they call donors starting material, because it's easier to think of it in that sense if you are mass producing a therapeutic product from a volunteer donor, I guess. And then Registry 2.0, this is where ADCUs and quite possibly DDCUs might pop up in the next few weeks even. And these are the adult donor cryopreserved units. This is the ready-to-ship off-the-shelf product. So registries might be evolving into biobanks of characterized, immediately available cellular products. If the question comes up, what is a DDCU? It's the same as an ADCU, however, it is a bone marrow product collected from a cadaver donor. They are seeing massive yields in terms of product size, multiple bags per individual, but of course you can't go back to the donor either. So in that sense, it's a little bit more like a cord blood unit. So in conclusion, we have a few key takeaways that I would like to leave you with today. First, it is the donor for all reality, with all of the new sources available, and with the advent of PTSI, or the more readily available PTSI protocols, there could potentially, there is a donor for everyone now. You should rather think in terms of what is possible. So since the outcomes for mismatched donors are now very similar to that of a matched donor, you should let the source dictate your decision making and the time frame for your patient. That time paradigm is the third one. Speed really matters. In high-risk disease, time to transplant is critical. So don't wait for the perfect donor. Go with the donor that you have, even if that is not what you would traditionally consider the perfect donor. And biology over dogma. So donor age, CMV, and kinship are becoming as important as HLA match in the modern algorithm. So the question is no longer, do we have a donor, but rather which donor is optimal for this specific patient right now. And this is made possible through all of the new technologies that have come through. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. And I'll take some questions.
Wow. Alicia, thank you. This was a very good talk. The first time I hear about the APQs, so that's quite interesting. I don't know if there's anyone else that would like to, or who has a question. I don't see anyone with any questions. So I've got some questions for you. So my first question is, what is the cost comparison between a cord blood transplant and a matched unrelated donor transplant?
That's a good question. So every registry in the world gets to set their own fee schedule. So there is no set price globally, and WMDA does not regulate or control the pricing internationally. But it is not uncommon for a cord blood unit to be almost double the price of a matched unrelated donor. I remember the very last quote I got for a South African patient was in, I guess, about 2018, so that's already quite a while ago, but it was from the New York Cord Blood Bank, and it was 1.25 million South African rands for a cord blood unit from New York.
Wow. Okay, so that's quite expensive. And then what do you foresee is going to be like the cost of these ADCUs? I mean, would they be cheaper?
From what we've been told, and I would recommend that you reach out directly to the organization that's currently banking. Right now, there's only one organization banking this particular type of product, and that's DKMS. They've already started making these products available for direct shipment, even though they're not available on search and match yet. But from what I understand, the price is very comparable to that of a matched unrelated donor. So it's definitely competing hard in that cord blood space.
Okay, and it's only the DKMS that's doing the banking at the moment. No other
Banking
unit.
of the ADCUs, yes.
Yeah.
NMDP stored a few, but they are not really making them commercially available. They're using them internally at the moment.
Okay. Then I've got another question. So if you could choose between, because sometimes I get confused. So often you talk about a 5 to 7 out of 10 match, or maybe like a 9 out of 10 match. So my question is, what would you choose, a 5 out of 8 versus a 7 out of 10? Because in South Africa, we generally use the 10, that would be high
The 10
resolution.
out of 10. Yeah. So the match grade requirement in South Africa is 10 out of 10, and it is true also for most of Europe. In other parts of the world, it is out of 8, and then they ignore HLA DQB1 matching. They have found in their own research that it is sort of negligible whether or not you match for DQ. So they already accept whether or not that's a match or not is irrelevant, and then they add additional matches or mismatches from there. But I think you shouldn't get too hung up about if it's out of 8 or out of 10. You should really just count the number of mismatches, and then if you know that there's mismatches, and make absolutely sure you have a very good donor-specific antibody panel, so that you can avoid mismatches for those antibodies. And keep in mind then that you should take extra care looking at HLA-DPB1, because that's often a very good indicator on whether this mismatch is going to be in the graft versus host, or host versus graft direction. So are you going to have to deal with severe or acute or chronic graft versus host disease, or are you potentially facing graft rejection, and that's where DBB1 really starts to play a role when you're fiddling with mismatches.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And then I wanted to ask you, so you showed us that graph about the expanded donor availability if you improve your, if you have more mismatches.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to create a graph like that for South Africa, like a South African specific graph?
Yes, absolutely. Someone would just have to spend quite a bit of time collating the data between SABMR and DKMS, because there's now those two registries combined have a really large and representative pool of the South African population. And more registries globally are doing exactly this. For sad reasons, unfortunately, not for happy reasons, because of what is currently going on geopolitically. Registries are looking more and more at what would happen if you can no longer import stem cells from country A or country B, or what happens in a situation where all flights are downed for an indeterminate amount of time because of something happening in the world, and you simply cannot move stem cells or any biological matter across borders. Then you really have to understand and know and have reassurance in the fact that whatever you've banked in your country, that's all you have access to now. So more and more registries around the world are getting government funding to do the research and understanding, is there is the registry they've built up in their country sufficient to sustain their patient population in those scenarios. We're currently facilitating such a study for Australia, and last year we did one for Spain. So yes, this is a question on everyone's minds right now.
Okay, then I see Garrick asked a couple of questions, so I'm going to quickly go through them.
Yeah.
He asked, does the grid number translate just to the WMDA, or is it a regulatory requirement for every registry?
It's regulatory for every single registry everywhere, but it only goes for donors. You don't have to have a grid number for a cord blood unit, but every single volunteer unrelated donor has to have a grid number, and it is managed by the registry that they've been recruited by. But the numbering system itself is governed by WMDA in collaboration with ICBA. They're an ISBT sort of a leg of ISBT.
Okay, then the second question was, in donor selection, does selection based on sex or ABO compatibility or grouping really matter compared to the hard criteria for selection? Yeah.
Oh, I love this question. It really comes down to how big you want to make your patient cohort, your patient donor cohort, and there's so much data available on this, and I think that so many different retrospective studies have been done all over the world to understand what role does this really play. And if you look at all of the non-HLA factors for donor selection, so forget about HLA. Don't worry if it's a match or not a match, and you only had to choose on the non-HLA factors. You wouldn't even think about looking at sex or ABO before looking at the age. You will always go for the youngest donor, and then sex. Either you want to match the sex, or more and more, it is becoming evident that honestly, you could probably manage if you are transplanting from even a Paris female, any female that has had a pregnancy, even if that pregnancy didn't come to term. So that's one paradigm. But because women are now also getting pregnant and having children at a much older stage in their life, as long as you go for the youngest donor, it shouldn't matter if that's male or female. In terms of ABO, again, excellent question, but there is really, in the really big cohort studies, no evidence to suggest that you should be matching for ABO. I mean, sometimes it works out much better and it is easier to manage the patient. So if you don't want to jump through too many hoops, by all means match for ABO, but it's not necessarily going to be the make or break in terms of the survival of the patient in the end.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, so Sanbus does the stem cell processing for most of the other units, even in public sector, and they do a great job to do either plasma depletion or red cell depletion. So just to say that I think ABO incompatibility is probably not the biggest thing anymore. And of course, they can also do plasma exchange for the patient prior to the transplant. So yeah, I agree. I think the younger donor, the better. Sex doesn't matter so much. ABO, well, unless it's a major mismatch, then you still need to be quite vigilant for hemolysis afterwards and pure-retinal aplasia. But other than that, not really. Okay, are there any other questions? Sure. This was an excellent talk, Alicia. Really, thank you. And I mean, I've learned about the ADCUs now. That is very interesting. And maybe that's something we should think about in South Africa. I don't know.
Absolutely. And DDCUs, the bone marrow derived from cadaver donors, that is a very real product, and it has incredible potential. They are getting incredible counts, post-thaw counts from it. So some of the early studies that they've already published are showing many mismatches, but because of the high cell counts, it almost ignores the fact that there are so many mismatches, and the patients are showing excellent post-transplantation survival rates and outcomes. So not just on survival, but disease-free survival, which is excellent.
So,
That's what we want to
so,
see.
so just out of interest, so if you do, how quickly must they get the stem cells out? I mean, does the patient need to be like a heart or a lung or like a solid organ? Must it also be kept
So
perfused?
it's the same protocol as for solid organ collection. Right now, they're only collecting this in the US at a very small selective group of hospitals that they have a really good working relationship with. So WMDA is also investigating this, and we would like to see a little bit more in terms of outcomes data. It's a very new product or a very new treatment possibility, but essentially it's no different from fresh bone marrow. It's still bone marrow, right? It doesn't the source, the fact that the donor is no longer alive doesn't has no impact on the quality of the bone marrow, so that shouldn't matter.
I've got one last question. So, what about the mutational status of the CCR5, especially for our South African patients, where maybe you can get a donor that has this mutation and you would cure them from HIV? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I think it's important information, but is that only upon request, or do the registries now start testing for this?
It is not routine for registries to test CCR5. It was sort of sad to say, a bit of a fad at a point where registries tested all of the donors that they recruited for CCR5, thinking that, well, maybe they will be able to serve a whole new type of patient population. A lot of research has also gone into this, and I had a particularly good conversation with Dr. Michael Pepper about exactly this scenario. And the truth of it is, in South Africa, a stem cell transplantation is still a very, very high risk procedure, whereas living with HIV, if you are on antiretrovirals, you can have an excellent quality of life. That quality of life cannot be guaranteed post transplantation. So, would you risk a patient's quality of life if they've already got a really good quality of life? Would you risk their quality of life and potential death with a stem cell transplant if that's not really necessary with the ARVs? So I think that's a really good question to consider. If they already have leukemia and you are going to transplant them anyway to cure them of the leukemia, you might as well take that extra step and say, well, let's test the CCR5. Let's see if we can find that mutation, and we can sort of hit two birds with one stone. Absolutely do that. But should we start transplanting HIV positive patients just to cure their HIV? My strong feeling is no. But I'm not a clinician.
Okay. Well, we already 15 minutes post our time, so thank you very much for this talk. It was very informative and really, really enjoyed it. I'm wondering maybe you can do a future talk for us about the DDUs, That would be
Yeah.
interesting.
ADCUs and DDCUs,
Yeah.
we are just wrapping up a project at the WMDA so that we can start listing them. But once we're listing, we would do a talk for our entire membership, and I'm happy to repeat it here for this journal club as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much and have a good evening. And yeah, thank you for your
Thanks.
time. Take care.
You're
Bye.
welcome. Thanks, everyone. Bye.